Jean-Jacques Rousseau is born in Geneva in 1712 to a watchmaker father and a mother who died soon after his birth. They were not a wealthy family, but they were voting citizens of Geneva, and so Jean was raised a Calvinist. And initially he was raised by his father, but then by his aunt. His father sends him to his aunt to raise him. And a key turn comes in his life when he misses the city curfew in March 1728. He's outside the city gates and they're locked. And so what does he do? He wanders. He wanders to a nearby town in Savoy, in France, and he meets. He was met by a local aristocratic lady and taken in by her. Her name was Madame de Warren. I don't really know how to say her name. Warrens? I'm going to call her Warrens. She protected him and educated him. And Warrens was actually acting as a kind of covert spy for the Roman Catholic Church at this time. And she eventually sends young Rousseau to Turin, where he converted to the Roman faith, and he even began to study to become a priest. But, and this may be surprising or not surprising to us today, during his studies he's propositioned by one of the Roman clergy, and so he quickly leaves Turin and abandons his intentions to become a cleric. This prompted him again to turn away from this, and he returns to Savoy and completes his education with his Madame. And this period in his life, he began a common pattern of vocational failure. He repeatedly tried different jobs and callings, and he also begins a pattern of dependence upon others. He was consistently placing himself in positions of financial reliance upon others, particularly women, interestingly. But at this time he was also developing as an intellectual, a composer, a writer, a philosopher and a poet. So he had a lot of different things that he could do quite well. He moved to Paris in 1742 and he met the famous Denis Diderot. If you've heard of Diderot, he's a very famous thinker. He was visiting Diderot when Diderot was in prison for impiety in 1749, that Rousseau began his journey to prominence. He decided to dedicate himself to the pursuit of truth and virtue, and decided to write an essay for a prominent prize competition. And this is similar to the prize competition that he entered for the Discourse on Inequality, which is the reading for next week. His essay demonstrates his breadth of classical learning, and the essay was a defence of the Spartan Roman civic generals against the Athenian practice of being ruled by poets and orators. And the essay won the prize, and it gave him exposure across Europe. But as I was just discussing with Dr. Myers, this was really an accident. He wasn't intending to be an essayist or a philosopher, although he was dabbling in all of these things. But really he won this by accident, and he found himself a very prominent intellectual. His next major work after this essay was the Discourse on Inequality, which was published in May 1754, 1 month before he returned to his home city from Paris. He moved back to Geneva in June 1754, renounced his Catholicism, converted back to Calvinism, which he needed to in order to return to Genevan citizenship with full voting rights. And he continued to write and continued to be well regarded for his philosophical, literary and artistic works. In 1758, he published The State of War, which is a critique of Hobbes's pessimistic anthropology. We're not reading that this semester, but that's worth keeping in mind. And we will return to that theme as well anyway. 4 years later, in 1562, he published what became his most famous works, Emile, which is a treatise on education, and The Social Contract, which we're reading together this semester as well.
1562 or 17?
1762, thank you very much. I shifted into my natural gear there and typed 1562. Both of these received official condemnation and were publicly burned.
That's when you know they're a good book.
No, well that's right, because both works became absolutely pivotal in the history of Western thought. Emile is a treatise emphasising, and this is really important, Emile is a treatise emphasising the natural innocence and natural genius of the child, and has had a tremendous impact on many modern and contemporary child-directed education theories. It constitutes a great work of political philosophy in and of itself, especially if one considers the care with which great thinkers like Plato and Aristotle took over the question of education in their own works of political philosophy. Education is a deeply political question, but it's one which we won't be addressing in this unit. Sorry to say. The social contract, on the other hand, is Rousseau's attempt to articulate a justification for political existence and a theory of politics and institutions. The book is praised both as a forerunner of modern democracy, but also as a blueprint for modern totalitarianism. We'll return to those themes too in the coming weeks. There's plenty to talk about, as you can see. Rousseau died in 1778, and he was originally buried on the Isle of Poplars at Ermenville, however, as a symbol of the impact of his work on the French Revolution. In 1794, his ashes were ceremonially removed from the original grave, transported by torchlight, and reinterred at the Pantheon in Paris. There is little doubt that Rousseau was a superb thinker, a mercurial talent, a remarkable polymath, and one of the most influential intellectuals in history. Even if one focuses merely on his political philosophy, he would be placed next to Thomas Hobbes and Karl Marx in the metaphorical pantheon of truly original and profound thinkers of the modern era. However, like a number of great thinkers, he was not a great man. Indeed, he was, if you ask me, repulsive. His life was one of dependence on others, and not in a healthy and humble way. He had a reputation for being sexually deviant. His life was not morally upright. And even though he purported to love humanity and claimed that his life mission was to pursue truth and virtue, his lived existence exhibited the exact opposite. Some of his associates, sometimes friends and acquaintances, used the following words to sum him up. Diderot said Rousseau was deceitful, vain as Satan, ungrateful, cruel, and full of malice. David Hume, who I think you've all read, moved from initially admiring Rousseau to concluding that he was a monster who saw himself as the only important being in the universe. One of the many kind and perhaps naive women who helped Rousseau said to him, "I have nothing left for you but pity." Now, why do I raise these apparent character assassinations with you? What's that? To poison the well, that's right. Yes. No, not quite. It is actually to consider the connection between one's morals and one's ideas. A person can have profound thoughts, can string together beautiful words, and can even claim to be a great humanitarian, which is what Rousseau claimed to be. And Rousseau had those qualities. He was profound, and he was a brilliant writer, as you'll see when you read him. But he also confesses in his autobiography, which is a very famous autobiography, to a total lack of consideration for those to whom he has natural duty toward. Rousseau never married. He did have a mistress for 33 years named Therese, and he went through a pseudo wedding with her after 25 of these years, and she bore 5 children to him. And one of his greatest achievements is his book on education, on the education of children. But in actual fact, and in real life, he had a total disregard for children. Indeed, each child that Therese bore to Rousseau was methodically abandoned. The first child was not named, and no record of the sex is extant. The baby was taken by the midwife present at birth to the local children's hospital, and Rousseau and Therese never saw the child again. Rousseau claims that he decided to do this to protect Therese's honour. But the fact that this act was repeated 4 further times to the same anonymous effect makes one question whose honour was actually being protected. Indeed, it seems that, by Rousseau's own admission, his children were an inconvenience. This is what he says: "How could I achieve the tranquility of mind necessary for my work?" He did not want to be a father. He did not want to be responsible for children, and he did not want to bring his children up in a context associated with the lower class family of his mistress. He was a bit of a snob. He died in 1788, aged 67. And I do not raise these unpleasant facts about his life simply to dump on him or to poison the well, and nor do I want to undermine the possible good points of his thought, which we will study. However, Rousseau's life raises the question, what is the connection between the character of the thinker and their ideas? Does character matter in philosophy? In one sense, it obviously doesn't, because ideas are just that. They can, to an extent, be removed from their context. They can be understood and grappled with without reference to their context to a limited extent. However, in some cases, the degradation of someone like Rousseau does call into question his ideas when they relate so closely to human nature, questions of morality, and the claim to want to benefit mankind. They don't automatically invalidate them, that would be a fallacy. And yet the ideas fall under a different light if considered in that context. For instance, Rousseau's claim to know the true nature of a child is a particularly curious one, given that he had no natural affection for his own children. His claim to be a great humanitarian who cares very much for virtue and freedom does seem rather incongruous given his life. And this might lead us to ask some questions about what really underlies his political descriptions and prescriptions. Indeed, Rousseau had the temerity to suggest that he alone could speak with integrity on the matters that he did. He thought he had been little corrupted by human society, and he had never sustained any idea of premeditated evil. That was what he claimed about himself. Therefore, he could stand above society as a philosopher and a judge. And I think we would all agree that that could be described as hubris and arrogance. If someone had such a dramatic deficiency in his character, as Rousseau does, are they then a trustworthy guide for something like political life or moral philosophy? Why should we listen to someone like Rousseau, given that he seems to care very little for anyone but himself? Such questions might seem a little harsh, and indeed they are rather probing and perhaps uncomfortable. And perhaps they even raise questions for you. Why should people listen to what you think? Are you the kind of person, the kind of character who deserves to be taken seriously when you postulate and pontificate in the classroom? Does your moral life reflect the wisdom necessary to undertake to lecture others about anything of importance? There are two answers to this question, both of them applying to Rousseau and to you. First, you deserve to be heard because you reflect something of the human spirit. Your ideas contribute to the greater picture of what humanity is, for better or for worse. Your moral uprightness or moral degradation does not mean that we should not hear you out. Similar with Rousseau, we should listen to him in spite of his shortcomings. His shortcomings are your shortcomings too, and they are mine. If we want to be heard, then we should also listen. The other reason we should listen to Rousseau is that moral failings count for nothing in terms of being influential, and Rousseau is tremendously influential. His ideas shape Western thought in a profound way. His anthropology, that is, his understanding of human nature, has permeated many academic and practical disciplines, most notably education and politics. His ideas are reflected in aspects of the environmentalist movement, notably his assertion that economic development is ruinous. His philosophy was read widely and imbibed by significant portions of the French intelligentsia, and he was ultimately lauded as a hero by the French revolutionaries. Many of his political prescriptions can be seen acted out in the French Revolution, although it might be a little too much to say that he was the main philosophical influence of that event. He is still very influential. What we can say is that even when it remains difficult to see people directly applying Rousseau, Rousseau is often metaphorically present in the French Revolution through the sentiments of the men who led it, the extreme emphasis on democracy, and the resulting totalitarianism. And if you don't know the history of the French Revolution, there is both of those things present in the French Revolution. Importantly for us today, Rousseau is worth reading because he is a remarkable mind and a remarkable writer. We aim to read great books in this course, and the works we are reading by Rousseau are undoubtedly in that category. He, along with Immanuel Kant, set the tone for much that follows in the period we refer to as the Enlightenment. And when we speak of modernity, we are partly speaking of something that Rousseau helped to construct. While there are very few card-carrying Rousseauians today, there are very few people today that would not be affected in some substantial way by his ideas, such as the importance of the figure that we're dealing with. So now I'm going to move on to his ideas in a little bit of detail. So over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be examining two of Rousseau's great political works, the Discourse on Inequality and the Social Contract. The Discourse represents a clear assertion of Rousseau's political anthropology, whereas the Social Contract is the closest thing we have to a full-blown political theory in Rousseau's corpus. The first thing to note about Rousseau's method in his writings, particularly on his thought, particularly as it pertains to the Discourse, is that he has a particular view of history. Indeed, history is played off against nature. They're two very important categories, history and nature. He does not want to search history for wisdom, as Polybius, Thucydides, Augustine, Plutarch, and countless other Western thinkers did. Indeed, this remains a standard view of the purpose of history today, that it's a repository of wisdom, but Rousseau mocks the idea. For him, history is in opposition to nature. Nature is the source of wisdom and perfection. Before history, there was nature, and nature was good. The role and idea of history in Rousseau's project is informative for much of the revolutionary and liberal literature that we will read for the rest of the semester. For Rousseau, history is not the grounds upon which humankind builds the edifice of civil rights and liberties. For someone like Edmund Burke and Kirk, who we'll read at the end of the semester, Russell Kirk, conservative thinkers, history is much more important for these men. But for Rousseau and for liberalism more generally, natural rights and natural liberties are founded on nature. Hence why he says in the opening of the Discourse that he is not interested in establishing the facts of humanity's origin, rather he is interested in basic human nature. He is interested in nature and not facts. His negative view of history is furthered in the argument of the Discourse when he argues that humans are degraded by society. We will return to this, but it is notable because for Rousseau, history is the forum in which nature is corrupted. If history had not intervened, if humans had not built societies which make history, human nature would have been pure. So history for Rousseau is not the site of inspiration nor of moral insight, and it is certainly not the site upon which we construct an edifice of rights. On the contrary, history is the site of corruption. For Rousseau, we must return to nature, return to prehistory, before we can properly see humanity in its ideal form. And this leads us to the second primary point about Rousseau's thought and method, and it's to do with his anthropology. For Rousseau, society is a corruption. It is a corruption because before society, man was perfect. This will be unpacked in detail in the Discourse. This seems to be an unusual starting point for political philosophy. It sounds like a kind of anthropological negation of politics. However, it is important to note that it is quite the opposite. We will see more about this in the coming weeks, but I will make some brief comments and ask some questions that will I hope, helpfully stimulate the discussion. Like Hobbes, Rousseau builds his political thought on anthropology. If you think about it, you cannot do otherwise. Even when people do not state an anthropology, they are assuming one. Silence is not an absence in this case, it is merely a lack of articulation. But Rousseau does state an anthropology, and his anthropology is of natural man. But what is natural man for Rousseau? Natural man is uncorrupted and perfect. He is isolated. He is individual. He is naive. And that's a positive thing. His disposition is towards self-preservation but away from any violence and coercion. Natural man is capable of learning and is capable of a level of reason, but only with reference to self-preservation. Nature is where natural man dwells, and it is stable and revolves rather than progresses. Remember, nature is placed over and against history. History progresses, nature is stationary. Rousseau is aware of Hobbes's depiction of the state of nature, and he disagrees with it. Indeed, he criticises him quite a lot in the discourses over this question. For Rousseau, Hobbes actually depicted political man in a state of anarchy. We'll turn to why he says this soon when we address Rousseau's understanding of human corruption. But back to natural man. Rousseau's depiction of natural man in the discourse is idyllic. This is a quote. "I see him satisfying his hunger under an oak tree, quenching his thirst at the first stream, finding his bed at the foot of the same tree that supplied his meal, and thus all his needs are satisfied." Natural man is able to negotiate a reasonable existence in nature. He can defend himself against the animals, and he will be naturally strong with his outdoor active lifestyle. There is no distinct problem with natural man, physically speaking. Who is this man then? We know what he is, but who is he from a moral, personal point of view? Does he desire knowledge? On what grounds and for what reason? What was the role of reason in the state of nature, according to Rousseau? Well, he does not desire knowledge, and he is a savage. Savage man, natural man, did not need anything more than what nature had to offer him, and therefore he did not desire anything beyond this. His imagination depicts nothing to him. This is a quote. His imagination depicts nothing to him. His heart asks nothing of him. His modest needs are so easily found at hand. It's quite a serene image that he has. Natural man is a man without passions. He has no desires, no wants, no emotional needs. He speaks, but only insofar as he needs to speak to get what he needs to survive. Natural man, remember, is perfect. He does not do anything beyond sustaining his own life. He has a love of self, an amour de soi, a kind of healthy self-regard. So that is the phrase that's used, amour de soi, A-M-O-U-R-D-E-S-O-I, amour de soi. So imagine it as a healthy self-regard or a healthy self-love. We move now to consider Rousseau's understanding of the moral side of natural man. The fundamental virtue of natural man is pity. Pity is an identification of oneself with another, according to Rousseau. This identification was able to be closer and more intimate in the state of nature than it is now. Current conditions prevent true natural virtue from emerging. Pity caused natural man to feel generous and merciful to fellow men. Pity is what carries us without reflection to the aid of those we see suffering, says Rousseau. Pity is, for Rousseau, obviously the primary natural sentiment, but it is a virtue and a sentiment that is felt pre-reflection. That is, before the natural man has considered his position alongside others. He is not yet in competition with others. He is not yet seeking gain. He is not yet jealous or envious. He is self-protective, but he's not lacking in pity for other people. Interestingly, even romantic love is not present in natural man. Sex is a normal act for Rousseau's noble savage, but love being, and I quote, founded on certain notions of merit and beauty, and natural man's heart being not susceptible to sentiments of admiration and love, he pays exclusive attention to the sexual appetite he has received from nature. Personal interactions are limited to the intuitive and instinctive in the state of nature, so that even sex is merely an animalistic drive. And this is a little side note, but here again I think we find another part of Rousseau's thought which our society might be retrieving. Sex is no longer an act shared by people who care for one another. Indeed, in some or many cases, sex is an act participated in by two people who may not have the slightest personal interest in each other at all. Sex for our society has become animalistic and lacks sentiment. It is purely for base pleasure and not for relationship or companionship. But that is just a side note, which is not relevant. So, just a thought. What does this particular view of natural man mean, taken as a whole? How does it challenge our own views and perceptions of human nature? If natural man is ideal man, what does that make us? Another question that is raised is related to freedom. If freedom is an ideal state, a state where the individual is at liberty to thrive, say, is Rousseau's man perfectly free? Is that freedom attractive to you? For Rousseau, it is attractive and ideal because his view of civil man, of political man, is a degraded one. Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. Man is by nature born equal, but society drains him of his dignity, and inequality emerges. And it is in the Discourse that Rousseau addresses these matters. Remember, he is interested in inequality because there is an essay contest on the topic of inequality. His Discourse is written for this purpose. However, civil inequality is also non-existent in the state of nature. The only inequality is natural inequality, which is perfectly acceptable and unavoidable. It is civil inequality which concerns Rousseau in the Discourse. And this appears when humans come into competition for resources. And here, we might say, is Rousseau's fall narrative. He characterises the process by which man becomes social as the making of an evil being. The problem here is not sin, it is merely evil. For Rousseau, evil is anything that degrades natural man. Here, in the socialising of man, are the origins of inequality. Inequality is born, and inequality creates more inequality. For Rousseau, society begins when people become self-conscious in relation to other people. They start to regard their own preservation as more important than others. It is also connected to pride and selfishness, whereas amour de soi was natural self-love that only desired self-preservation. This is the beginning of what he calls amour pauper, or so same spelling as amour, A-M-O-U-R, and then this is spelled like this, P-R-O-P-R-E, pauper, a selfish desire to increase one's lot, better oneself and improve one's standing over against others is amour pauper. In the introduction to your text, or at least the edition that I have, which is the 2011 edition, David Wooten has a helpful illustration on page XXI 21 of the intro. This is what he says: people suffer from amour pauper. People that suffer from amour pauper do not merely have a car to get from A to B, they have a larger car than their neighbours, so that other people will see how important they are. Or they have a faster car, so that others will see how vigorous they are. Or a classic car, so that others will see what good taste they have. Probably a helpful illustration. Here we might divide things up into different categories. We have a real basic need to eat so that we survive. I think we all agree with that. However, I love eating at Flute in Coorparoo, especially their burgers. And I want others to see that I enjoy the burgers at Flute because they will recognise my acquired taste in food, as well as my sensitivity to being trendy and inner city, and even kind of hipster. So there is here for Rousseau a distinction between the true natural self and the false civic self, which is the one that likes Flute and wants to put it up on Instagram when they're eating there. The true self needs food. The false self needs the Flute Cafe burger on Instagram. As we progress along this road, we reach the point where in order to make ends meet in a world of limited resources and growing population, Rousseau thinks then we need to enclose the commons. Remember, there is no property at this point. We're all still in a state of nature, but things are starting to degenerate. Rousseau's famous line at the beginning of part 2 of the Discourse is, "The first person who, having enclosed a plot of land, took into his head to say, 'This is mine,' and found people simply enough to believe him." simple enough to believe him, is the true founder of civil society. What wars, crimes, murders, what miseries and horrors would the human race have been spared had someone pulled up the stakes or filled in the ditch and cried out, "Do not listen to this impostor"? The move to begin private property is the greatest treachery and crime against human nature. But even when natural man did not know the miseries of civic life, natural man still became aware of differences and started to compare his natural abilities to others and to pride, and then the amour propre. Society grows from here, with relations being formed based on the ordering of individuals in response to their natural abilities. Private property is an inevitable growth from this point, and this results in the desire to protect private property. This results in the desire to protect private property, and this meant the formation of small villages and communities who formed particular attachments to one another. And from there, the move toward vice and evil continues. Society for Rousseau is the defamation of man. It is a terrible injustice, an unmitigated disaster. Human nature is defaced by ordered social relations due to this. Human nature is defaced by ordered social relations due to the true self, the natural man, and so this is due to the true self or the natural man being lost amongst the mess of unnatural and selfish desires. We also see alongside the development of politics and society, the development of man's capacity to reason, to be creative and innovative and so on. Skill and reflection become valuable and worth pursuing. And as civic life grows and as conflict grows between selfish people at the same time, compare their Hobbes, natural rights and freedoms are lost. The fall is complete, and here history overtakes nature and civic man destroys natural man. So, the question you're probably asking at this point is, well, why politics? Right? Sounds like a bad idea, doesn't it? Why did Rousseau bother to continue on to the question of political life? If society is so poisonous for human nature, wouldn't it be better to abandon the project and return to the life of the noble savage? Voltaire is said to have responded to Rousseau's discourse by saying, "Never was such cleverness used in the design of making us all stupid. One longs in reading your book to walk on all fours, but as I've lost that habit for more than 60 years, I feel happily the impossibility of resuming it. Nor can I embark in search of the savages of Canada, because the maladies to which I am condemned render a European surgeon necessary for me." See the irony there? Because war is going on in those regions, and because the example of our actions has made the savages nearly as bad as ourselves. Another thinker noted wryly that Rousseau persisted in living in the comfort of France and Geneva his entire life. He hardly attempted to return to this ideal condition of the natural man. But perhaps we miss the point of the discourse if we make these critiques the sole lens through which we consider it. For Rousseau never suggests that anyone should attempt to return to the state of nature, merely that he should consider it when in turn considering our own condition. And what about his choice to remain comfortable in Paris and France? In Geneva and France? Well, we have explored his moral failings already. Let us consider the more philosophical approach to these questions. One likely answer is that Rousseau sees politics as being able to restore the rights, the natural rights that man enjoyed in a state of nature. In fact, politics can restore them and enhance them. Political life is a corruption, but it is unavoidable. Rousseau is under no illusions. Rather than avoid it, Rousseau's design is to harness the potential for politics to retrieve natural rights and natural liberties. Politics is the forum where man can reclaim what he has lost. And in some cases, he can improve on those things in the political condition. And hence the book, The Social Contract. The social contract is Rousseau's attempt to describe a legitimate political existence in light of the conception of human nature he outlines in his discourse. It is notable that this discourse contains some obviously revolutionary sentiments, as do the early sections of the social contract. Rousseau's relationship to the French Revolution, as I've already said, is a little bit ambiguous, but there is no question that the initial leadership of the uprising of 1793 was heavily influenced by Rousseau. But does this mean that Rousseau would have endorsed the French Revolution? Well, it's possible, but it's hard to be sure. We do know that his view of the formation of a polity and the grounds upon which a polity stands lend themselves to a revolutionary and to a non-revolutionary liberal view of politics as well. Society for Rousseau is founded upon an agreement. Humans are fundamentally and once they reach the age of, oh, that doesn't make sense. I've got a sentence here that doesn't make sense. Excuse me. On the video, humans, once they reach the age of reason, are fundamentally bound only to themselves and rightly act on their own behalf. No one has natural authority over others, and force does not give anyone a legitimate right over others. So agreements are the only mechanism to form a proper society. So how is society formed? It is not an agreement between a people and a ruler. It is first an agreement only by the people to become a people. People must find a form of association. This is a quote from 1.6 in the social contract. People must find a form of association that defends and protects with all common forces the person and goods of each associate, and by means of which each one, while united with all, nevertheless obeys only himself and remains as free as before. So these are the elements that Rousseau must unravel. A polity must provide a common defence for those who associate with it. So they have to defend the person and the goods of the people who decide to associate, and must provide a unity to do this, whilst ensuring that the person associating is obeying no one but himself. Everyone following that? So it has to provide a common defence for the people, but it also must provide a way to do this wherein a person is obeying no one but himself, and therefore maintaining their own liberty. There must, argues Rousseau, be an agreement or a contract which has clauses to that effect, whilst also allowing for complete political equality and liberty. Remember that Rousseau thinks that such an arrangement brings an end to natural rights. Society destroys what man has in nature. The key ideas here, and they are key for what we characterise as liberal political thought going forward, are equality and liberty. These are ideas which are important for pretty well any Western political ideology or any Western system of political thought. However, it is the prioritisation of these over and sometimes against all other political concepts which marks liberalism. For Rousseau, liberty is central and liberty is achievable through equality. So returning to the social contract, you will observe that Rousseau claims that an associate of the contract gains the equivalent of everything he loses, along with a greater amount of force to preserve what he has. So in agreeing to be a part of the contract, everything that he loses, he gives up in joining the contract. He gets back, but he gets more force to protect it with. He's affirming here that civil life has the potential in an ideal political association to actually increase the participants' ability to keep and protect their natural rights. How can then equality and liberty be maintained whilst entering into a mutual submission to a contractual arrangement? And the solution for Rousseau is the general will. And this was a phrase that Miss Smith used just before, the general will. Rousseau argues that each person in the social contract must place his own person and power in common under the direction of what he calls the general will. The parallel with Hobbes would of course be the sovereign, all right? But it's slightly different, and hopefully you understand why. Because logically prior to the general will is the sovereign. He has a figure called the sovereign as well. The sovereign is the body of all the contracting people formed into one public person. This body is the sovereign. The individual people are simultaneously a member of the sovereign and a subject to the sovereign, according to Rousseau. However, the contract occurs when the people submit themselves to the general will, not to the sovereign. Okay, that's when you join the contract, when you're submitting to the general will. But what is the general will? It seems to be, and it's a little bit hard to tell when you read Rousseau, but the general will seems to be the expression of the general interest of the body politic, that is, the people taken corporately, once all private and factional interests have been removed. The individuals can have a private will contrary to the general will, but even this private man joins the corporate body in participating and expressing the general will. Can I please warn you that the general will is famously elusive in definitions, so I'm doing my best. The general will, being the collective will of the individuals joined in the sovereign body, cannot err, according to Rousseau. It is always an expression of the general will by definition. It is the only way that private interests can be overcome. The general will is the solution to the problem of the amour propre. The general will always tends toward equality in its deliberations. It is the collective common interest of the self-interests of the citizens. It is all the self-interests of the citizens coming together to form a common interest. And it needs to be ascertained most obviously by a vote. However, Rousseau is not suggesting that a democratic vote won by a majority necessarily invokes the general will. Rather, all votes must be counted and considered. However, how to discern what the will is after a vote remains very ambiguous. He doesn't really resolve that issue. What is unambiguous is the necessity for individual wills to submit to the general will. To my mind, the most alarming part of the social contract is the paragraph where Rousseau argues that individuals cannot go against the general will. They can and will be forced to be free. That's what he says. They cannot go against the general will. They will be forced to be free. Now, this strikes me as profoundly problematic, and the whole concept of the general will comes under strain at this point. Individuality and particular rights seem to be entirely superseded by the general collective will. What is the method for choosing who needs to be forced to be free? Are there no grounds for resisting the general will? These are questions we might discuss over the coming weeks. Here are some others to consider as you read Rousseau. What is man's ideal condition, according to Rousseau? What role do rights and liberties have in Rousseau's political thought? What does Rousseau mean by liberty? How does Rousseau's view of natural man impact his view of political institutions? And is Rousseau ultimately ambivalent about political life? Does his negative view of the civil condition mean that he has a negative view of politics? These are some big questions that you could ask as you're reading Rousseau. And I'm going to finish in just a minute, but does anyone have any questions about that at this point?
I might have missed something, but how does a natural man exist without any passions if man is naturally going to compare themselves to each other and
it's a good question.
Get passion from that?
Good question.
Okay.
It's a great question. I think we should talk about it next week after you've read the Discourse and see whether Rousseau resolves it or not. I don't necessarily think he does. It's a little bit, it's one of those principles where it's like if you regress back to the point of, there's like a first principle lying underneath it that you can't really, like it's for him it's a first principle that you can't really resolve.
So is the only natural man like the pre-formal man?
Yeah, yeah. After that it's like all downhill.
Is Rousseau a Christian? Like if he's...
I don't think he...
Does his writing reflect any Christianity?
Well, I mean, so one of the essay questions in this unit is Hobbes' anthropology Christian? And you could ask the same question about Rousseau's, I think, and come to different answers for both thinkers. You know, you could go either way. I don't think he was in any sense a sort of an orthodox Christian. He was influenced by Christianity, but I think he thought it was a nice thing. But I don't think he thought it was true necessarily.
It's like, oh, that's nice.
Yeah, that's my sense of what he thought. He was definitely Christian, culturally Christian, but he doesn't have. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, and I mean, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. But it seems to me that his view of human nature is not one that is supportable by the Bible. If you were to take the Bible as some kind of marker for Christian belief, which I think is reasonable. Yeah. Some of what I said then won't be clear to you, right? Because you'll have to read it to really grasp it. But I guess I'm giving you some of the framework for what you're going to be reading. That's the idea. Just kind of some of the big questions, some of the themes that come up, and hopefully you can kind of piece together any gaps in there.